The boy on stage began to speak. Simon Cowell's face changed. His hand rose to stop the show. Because those words belonged to someone who died 12 years ago. The America's Got Talent stage was lit up in its signature red glow. Cameras rolling. Audience of 300 buzzing with anticipation. Simon Cowell sat at the judge's desk in his usual position, arms crossed, that familiar expression of skeptical evaluation on his face. The contestant walked onto the stage. A boy. Maybe 9 years old. Small for his age. Wearing a simple button-up shirt tucked into dark pants that looked a size too big. His hair was neatly combed. His hands trembled as he approached the microphone stand. Host Terry Crews greeted him with characteristic warmth. "Hey there, young man! What's your name?" "Ethan," the boy said, his voice quiet, barely reaching the microphone. "Ethan Parker." "And how old are you, Ethan?" 9. "I'll be 10 in November." "That's fantastic." "And what are you going to do for us today?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his shoes, then back up at the judge's table. His eyes settled on Simon Cowell and stayed there. "I'm going to say some words," Ethan said, his voice steadier now. "Words I was told to remember. And then I'm going to sing a song." Simon's brow furrowed slightly. "Words you were told to remember? By whom?" "By someone who isn't here anymore," Ethan said simply. The audience fell quiet. Terry Crews glanced at the judges, uncertain whether to continue. Simon leaned forward slightly, his arms uncrossing. "Go ahead," Simon said, his tone gentler than usual. "We're listening." Ethan took a breath. His small hands gripped the microphone stand. And he spoke. "She said, when you're scared, remember that fear is just love that hasn't learned to trust yet. When you're alone, remember that every person you meet is carrying something heavy you can't see. And when you think you're not good enough, remember that someone believed in you before you even knew what that meant." The boy on stage started speaking and Simon Cowell's face transformed. His hand shot up to stop everything because those words belonged to someone who died 12 years ago. Simon's entire body went rigid. His hands gripped the edge of the judge's desk. That skeptical expression vanished, replaced by shock so complete that Howie Mandel immediately noticed and leaned over to touch his arm. "Simon? You okay?" Simon didn't respond. He was staring at Ethan like the boy had reached across the stage and grabbed him by the throat. His mouth opened slightly but no sound came out. The audience sensed something was wrong. The excited buzz died away. 300 people suddenly uncertain what they were witnessing. Ethan stood at the microphone, watching Simon's reaction with an intensity that seemed far too old for a 9-year-old's face. "Those words," Simon finally managed, his voice hoarse, barely controlled. "Where did you hear those words?" "My grandmother told them to me," Ethan said. "Before she died. She made me promise I would remember them exactly. She said they were important." "She said?" He paused, his young voice cracking with emotion. "She said that one day I might meet someone who needed to hear them again." Simon stood up. Abruptly. His chair scraped backward with a harsh sound that echoed through the studio. The other judges looked at each other in confusion. Sofia Vergara's hand flew to her mouth. Heidi Klum stood up too, concerned. "What was your grandmother's name?" Simon asked, his voice sharp now, almost aggressive. Ethan's eyes filled with tears but he didn't look away. "Margaret. Margaret Parker." "But she said some people used to call her Maggie." The control room erupted into chaos. Producers were shouting into headsets. "What's happening? Why did Simon stand up? Do we cut to commercial?" But director Ross Harper, who had worked with Simon for years, held up his hand. "No. Keep rolling. Something's happening." Simon stopped the show. No one knew what was happening. Simon walked out from behind the judge's desk. He didn't ask permission. He didn't look at the other judges or the host or the cameras. He walked straight toward the stage, his eyes locked on Ethan. Terry Crews stepped back instinctively, giving Simon space. The audience was completely silent now, sensing they were witnessing something far beyond a talent show audition. Simon stopped at the edge of the stage, looking up at Ethan. The boy stood his ground, still gripping the microphone stand, tears now streaming down his face but his chin raised, defiant. "How old was your grandmother when she died?" Simon asked. 74. She had cancer. She fought for 2 years. And she told you to remember those exact words? Yes, sir. Every night for the last month before she died, she made me repeat them. She said. Ethan's voice broke. She said that you gave them to her a long time ago, when she needed them. And now it was time to give them back. Simon's jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists at his sides. The legendary judge, known for crushing dreams and delivering harsh truths without mercy, was fighting tears on live television. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 2012. Simon Cowell wasn't always the untouchable television mogul. In 2012, he was certainly successful. X Factor was a global phenomenon, he was a household name, but he was also isolated. Divorced from his previous partners in business and life. Focused entirely on work. Building an empire but losing touch with anything resembling a normal human connection. That November, he was in New York for production meetings. Stressed. Exhausted. Running on coffee and 4 hours of sleep. He'd just come from a brutal meeting where lawyers were arguing over contracts and money and things that seemed increasingly meaningless. Walking back to his hotel late at night, he passed a small church with its doors open. Music was drifting out, a choir practicing for Sunday service. Simon normally would have walked past without a second thought. But something about the sound made him stop. He stood on the sidewalk, listening. The choir was singing an old hymn, something his mother used to hum when he was a child. The memory hit him with unexpected force. An elderly woman appeared in the church doorway. Silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Warm eyes magnified slightly behind wire-rimmed glasses. She was wearing a simple cardigan despite the cold, holding a cup of tea. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, gesturing to the music. "Yes," Simon said, surprised he'd answered at all. "You look like you're carrying something heavy," the woman observed. Not intrusive, just kind. "Would you like to come in? The tea is terrible but it's warm." Simon should have said no. Should have kept walking. Should have maintained the walls he'd built so carefully around himself. But something about this stranger's gentle observation made those walls seem suddenly exhausting. He went inside. The woman's name was Margaret Parker. Maggie to her friends. She was a volunteer at the church, helping organize community events, teaching piano to kids who couldn't afford lessons, the kind of person who showed up for people without expecting anything in return. They sat in a back pew while the choir practiced. Maggie didn't ask who Simon was or what he did. She just shared her terrible tea and talked about small things. The weather, the choir, her grandson who was obsessed with building blocks. "You seem like someone who's forgotten why they started," Maggie said eventually, her voice gentle but direct. "People who build empires often do. They get so focused on building higher that they forget why they wanted to build in the first place." Simon bristled at first. Who was this woman to psychoanalyze him? But something in her tone wasn't judgmental. It was understanding. Like she'd seen this pattern before in other driven, lonely people. "And what's your diagnosis then?" Simon asked, his sarcasm automatic but lacking real edge. Maggie smiled. "I think you're scared. I think you've built walls so high that you've forgotten what it feels like to let someone in. And I think you're exhausted from pretending those walls are strength instead of fear." Simon stared at this elderly woman who had known him for 15 minutes and somehow seen through defenses he'd spent decades constructing. "Fear is just love that hasn't learned to trust yet," Maggie said. "Every person you meet is carrying something heavy you can't see. And someone believed in you before you even knew what that meant. Those are the things I remind myself when I feel alone." They talked for 2 hours. About music. About ambition. About the difference between success and fulfillment. About Simon's mother, who had believed in him when he was a struggling record executive with more debt than sense. About Maggie's late husband, who had died 5 years earlier and left her learning how to be alone. When Simon finally left that church at nearly midnight, Maggie walked him to the door. She wrote her phone number on a scrap of paper. "Call me if you ever need reminding," she said. "That you're human. That vulnerability isn't weakness. That someone sees you." Simon kept that paper in his wallet. For the next 2 years, he called Maggie every few months. Never for long. Sometimes just to hear her voice telling him to slow down, to remember why he started, to let someone in. She became something he never had, not a therapist, not a business advisor, just a friend who expected nothing from him except honesty. In 2014, Maggie called him. Her voice was different. Tired. She'd been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The prognosis was months, not years. Simon flew to New York immediately. Visited her in the hospital. Held her hand while she told him not to waste energy being sad, that death was just another transition, that she'd lived a full life. "Promise me something," Maggie said during his last visit, her voice weak but her eyes still sharp. "Promise me you'll remember those words I told you. And promise me that when you meet someone who needs them, someone young and scared and convinced they're not enough, you'll pass them on." "I promise," Simon said. Maggie died 3 days later. Simon attended the funeral. Met her family, including a 6-year-old grandson named Ethan who sat in the front row looking lost and confused about why his grandmother wasn't coming back. Simon kept his promise in his own way. He became more patient with young contestants on his shows. He still gave honest critiques, but he looked for moments to build up instead of just tear down. He hit golden buzzers for people who reminded him that vulnerability takes more courage than bravado. But he never spoke about Maggie publicly. She was his secret. His reminder that beneath the sharp suits and sharper critiques was someone capable of being seen. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this performance is still ahead. And now, 12 years later, Maggie's grandson stood on the America's Got Talent stage, repeating the exact words she had spoken to Simon in that church pew. Words Simon had never told anyone. Words that existed only in his memory and apparently in the lessons Maggie had passed to her grandson. Simon was still standing at the edge of the stage, looking up at Ethan. The boy was crying openly now but hadn't moved from the microphone. "She talked about you," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "In the hospital. She said there was a man who forgot he was human until she reminded him. She made me memorize those words because she said you need to hear them again someday. She said you'd understand." Simon climbed onto the stage. He knelt down in front of Ethan, eye to eye with the small boy. Tears were streaming down his face. Simon Cowell, crying openly on live television. "Your grandmother," Simon said, his voice breaking, "saved my life. She taught me that being vulnerable isn't weakness. That someone always sees you, even when you think you're invisible." He pulled Ethan into an embrace. The boy sobbed into Simon's shoulder while 300 people and millions watching at home witnessed something sacred. Simon stood, kept one hand on Ethan's shoulder, and walked directly to the golden buzzer. He slammed his hand down without hesitation. Golden confetti exploded across the stage. The audience erupted. Standing, screaming, crying. The other judges were on their feet, tears streaming down their faces. Share and subscribe, so this story will never be forgotten. Ethan sang his song. It was beautiful. But everyone knew the real performance had already happened, a grandmother's final gift, delivered 12 years later by a boy who kept his promise. Simon keeps Maggie's words written on a card in his desk drawer. Before every taping, he reads them. A reminder that someone believed in him before he knew what that meant.